According to the World Bank, by 2025, 1.6 billion people are expected to be affected by the global housing shortage. In most countries, the cost of housing has grown faster than income. In a study of 200 cities globally, 90% were found to be unaffordable to live in, with the average income costing more than with the average home costing more than 3 times the average income. The countries we focused on in this region were already facing affordable housing issues well before the war in Ukraine. The mass displacement from Ukraine has only exacerbated these issues. Today, we are going to focus on discussing the findings of a piece of critical research Habitat commissioned in the summer of last year to better understand the affordable housing contexts in the 5 countries we are working in. We have a number of products from the multi-country research, and these will be made available online. The link will be shared at the end of this webinar in the chat, and we will also share it with the participants who have registered for the event. Today, we have with us 3 experts who have all been working in the affordable housing space in Europe for many years. Eshta Somogi will present the main findings of the research on long-term housing options for Ukrainian refugees and will present some recommendations based on a gap analysis of the individual countries' housing systems. Eshta works at the Metropolitan Research Institute, a Hungarian think tank, and has more than 25 years of experience in research and policy consultancy related to social and affordable housing, urban regeneration, and complex policy making targeting vulnerable people. Her expertise also includes national and local strategy development, aiming to secure social and affordable housing and linking housing policies with employment and education. Christine Goyer will talk specifically about the context in Poland and how accommodation needs of refugees in Poland is critical and should be seen as a key element in facilitating inclusion of refugees into Polish society. Christine is the deputy representative of the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, in Poland and has been working in the country since 2018. Prior to this, she was serving as Senior Protection Officer focusing on mixed migration at UNHCR headquarters in Geneva and has also held a number of positions focusing on protection and coordination at UNHCR in Uganda, DRC, Haiti, Syria, Turkey, and Ukraine. Our third panelist, Dr. Stefan Wettstein, will be commenting on key German case study findings directly from this research and will also conclude the panel discussion by pointing to 5 overarching longer-term strategic recommendations that link pre-existing affordable housing crises with the new refugee-induced pressures, and we'll also talk about how this applies to the wider European context. Stefan is an adjunct research fellow at the School of Social Sciences of the University of Western Australia. He is also jointly coordinating the working group on policy and research at the European Network for Housing Research. Stefan is a lead expert on urban strategic planning, sustainable housing, local governance, and local economic development. Thank you again for joining us. Eshta, I'm handing over to you to present the key findings from the research. Eshta, you're on mute.
Okay. Thank you. So I try to share the screen, but maybe you have to allow me, Bhushana. Sorry. Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm Esther Somogyi, and Bhushana already introduced me, so I will present the main findings of our research and long-term housing options for Ukrainian refugees. And my presentation consists of three main parts. And the first, I will show the results of gap analysis of the housing systems in the four neighboring countries to Ukraine, which was choose. These countries are Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and Romania. Then I will present our main findings relating the main forms of short-term housing solution for refugees that were provided so far. And then I will talk about shortly our recommendations. So just first a few words about the context of our gap analysis. So as already Vishana mentioned, the German housing system was used as a benchmark for the four new member states, as this country system is one of the most efficient housing system in Europe in terms of providing sufficient amount of affordable housing. However, we defined an ideal housing system based on the German housing system, as also Germany has, of course, some main problems. And the main characteristics of this ideal housing system are that there is an efficient market mechanism in place for both owner-occupied and private rental sector, and the subsidized sector provides affordable housing for lower middle class and low income households. However, as it was mentioned, there has been an affordable crisis growing on in Europe, and in the last decade, housing prices and rents sharply increased, which also put the middle class in a precarious situation. This is a general problem in the four new member states, but also hits Germany, especially in the main urban areas. In this graph, you can see the nominal house price changes in these five countries, and you can see that averagely it was the house prices increased by 140, 60%, so Hungary had a much sharper increase. So I will summarize the main results of our gap analysis of the four housing system comparing to the German housing system along 5 dimensions. Regarding the tenure structure, Germany has a very balanced tenure structure, meaning that the private rental sector has almost the same size that the owner-occupied sector. And while in the new member states, the main form of tenure is home ownership, and there's a very small private and municipal rental sector. Regarding the private rental sector, in Germany, the regulation produces a very balanced relationship between tenants and landlords, and favors long-term tenancies, and also provides through a soft rent control the general affordability of the private rental sector. On the contrary, in the 4 new member states, the private rental sector is under-regulated, there is an unpredictable tenant-landlord relations, and still a significant part of the sector operates in the informal market. Regarding the supply side subsidies to the housing sectors, in Germany there is a so-called tenure neutral model, which means that private and public housing companies receive subsidies under the same condition, while in the 4 new member states, subsidies favors largely home ownership. Regarding demand-side subsidies in Germany, housing allowances and social benefits results in the affordability of the housing sector for vulnerable and low-income groups, while in the 4 new member states, these subsidies exist, but their amount is not sufficient and do not guarantee the affordability of the housing sector for lower income groups. Regarding the governance of affordable and social housing policies, the main responsibilities lies in federal states in Germany, while municipalities and private landlords implement the programs, but the federal state has some special rights to establish social housing and energy efficient programs. In the 4 new member states, the main responsibility to provide affordable housing solutions lies in the hand of the municipalities. However, they lack sufficient funding for this, which means a significant disincentive for them to run and develop this sector. The central government launch programs related to social housing and affordable housing in these countries. However, they are very small scale programs. Despite these weaknesses of housing systems in these 4 countries, there are some progressive elements in their housing policies. First, on governance level, which provide institutional stability regarding delivering affordable housing solutions, and there are also some programs for affordable housing. These programs are mainly implemented in Poland and Slovakia. In Poland, there is a state bank and a publicly established development agency that coordinates and manages social and affordable rental programs. There are relatively new affordable rental program for cities, and there are also support for municipalities to increase their housing stock. In Slovakia, there is a stable institutional background for implementing and planning social housing policy. There is a state housing fund which was established in 1990. This is a revolving fund and provides sufficient funding for social housing programs, and there are programs for municipalities to increase their stock. However, a main problem is that the big cities did not engage in this program so far. In Romania, there is also a national housing agency, but it has a less significant role. And in Hungary, there is no state program at all for affordable rental housing and municipal housing. However, NGOs and municipalities have some important innovative initiatives in this field, mainly related to social rental agencies, but without state financing, they remain small scale. In the research, we collected the main form of ad hoc and short-term housing solutions for refugees. However, it's important to know that these 4 countries were not destination countries for asylum seekers before Russia's war on Ukraine, and therefore they lack infrastructure and service capacities to provide refugees. However, these countries adopted promptly legislation to ensure temporary protection status and rights of access to services and assistance. Regarding the provision of accommodation and housing, collective sites have been provided by municipalities, central governments, commercial entities, and the NGO sector. And also the solidarity housing was very significant from the beginning, which were provided mainly by private persons. However, the main providers of housing for refugees were and was and still is the private rental sector. We can see that refugees are concentrated in big cities and its surroundings. There is in every country there is a state allocation system, however, it is not compulsory to use. So refugees can also organize their own housing solutions. Regarding the funding and coordinating housing solutions, the main source of funding was the government provided compensation for landlords for accommodating refugees. This could be seen as an in-kind demand-side subsidy. In every country, this works on the same logic. This is a lump sum subsidy based on the number of persons per night. And in most countries, this is a sector-neutral schemes, meaning that also public, private, and NGOs entities can have access to this subsidy. And the negative side of the subsidy that is time limited, and it's very uncertain that governments how long they provide these subsidies. They cover not only accommodation cost, but the accommodation provider should also give some food and assistance for the refugees they house. Regarding coordination mechanisms of services and accommodations, the solutions vary by countries. But everywhere there is a center government-led mechanism in place, but also NGOs created platforms for coordinating services and accommodations. And in most of the countries, except for Hungary, these two kind of mechanisms cooperate with each other. And it is important to know that UNHCR is a key player in providing coordination. So we identified the most important housing-related challenges that countries face by accommodating refugees. One big problem is that there is a very serious locational mismatch regarding the availability and affordability of housing and the availability of job market, meaning that the big cities are jobs, but practically there is no housing, while in smaller places there are available housing, but they are not efficient job market. We could also see that there is no effective distribution system for refugees in the countries. And this means that the big urban centers are overcrowded, and they're overburdened, and even there are services, but even in those service capacities are not enough to provide refugees. We can also see the funding is short-term and unpredictable, which discourages private players, the private sectors in the housing sector, also in the regarding the solidarity housing providers and market housing providers to ensure housing for refugees. Regarding the private rental market, the arrival of refugees caused sharp price increases in some of the countries, and especially in big cities, for example, in Poland. And there is significant competition for rental housing between refugees and local demand. It was also a significant problem that it was difficult to administrate and monitoring private landlords who provided refugees, and we could identify the discrimination against specific groups such as Roma, but also families with several children in the private rental market. Regarding the public sector provisions, none of the country provided municipal housing for refugees because this sector is very small. And there were no vacant housing for refugees. And regarding collective sites, we could identify capacity and quality issues for refugees. We could also see that there is limited cash assistance available for refugees, which affected their options in the rental market, but also it appeared in the provision of some of to have access some very basic goods such as food, and this is related to the weak welfare state in these countries. There is also a serious problem regarding the territorial differences in service provision, and we could see that governments have no long-term plans so far regarding financing and providing housing solutions on longer term for refugees. So what were our main recommendations? We identified three models to provide long-term affordable rental housing for refugees, and distinction were made two main factors, namely that who receives the subsidies and who organizes the concrete solutions in a given scheme. We identified three types of actors. Those are landlords, tenants, and intermediary organizations. In the first model, in the landlord-based model, which aims to increase the supply of affordable housing. Sorry. So the landlords receive the subsidies and they organize the program. And the landlords can be private, public, or non-profit organizations. So in this sense, we follow the German tenure-neutral model. The interventions can cover renovation of existing sector, which try to mobilize the vacant dwelling and the vacant non-residential building, but they also can support the creation of new housing. Regarding the forms of the subsidies, they can be preferential loans and grants, and is a combination of these two. Can depend on the social status of the future tenants, for example, the proportion of social tenants or refugees. The second model, the tenants receive housing allowance or rent supplement. The main aim of this model to support the demand for affordable rental housing. In this model, a limit should be set to the maximum rent level for which the subsidy can be used, and this limit should be adjusted to the local market conditions. A positive effect of this model can be that it contributes to the whitening of the private rental market in these countries. However, it cannot solve the problem of the lack of affordable housing in urban areas. So if the supply is not increased, it can lead to rent increase in the cities, in the big cities. The third model is, yes?
Sorry to interrupt you. We are just running out of time, so maybe you can wrap up after this slide. Yep.
Yes. So the third model is the intermediary-based model, which aims to overcome institutional barriers in these countries, and it can ensure the more effective and appropriate use of subsidies in housing schemes. It can take up several, the organizations can take up several roles. They can administrate and distribute the subsidies, mediate between the supply and demand side of the market, and they also connect as developers. Such organizations as social rental agency, they are established in these countries almost everywhere, In Poland, they are legally regulated, and several big cities, just Bratislava, Poznan, and also in Budapest, municipalities established such organization, and also several NGOs run these schemes. Just to finish, governments should launch these programs, and it's important that the combination of these three programs can result in the effective delivery of housing solution, affordable housing solution for refugees. But it's important to also to set up an early intervention social response system, which can react to those households problem who are who are at risk to lose their housing. But in the long term, it's very important to improve the regulation of the private rental sector in these countries, as the investments can only happen if this rental sector is safe for both for landlords and tenants. And it would be also important to use EU funds on larger scale to increase affordable housing, and it should be programmed, and it is the responsibility of the national government. Okay, thank you for
Thank you very
attention.
Yeah.
Sorry for running.
Yeah, thank you very much, Esther. I think I'll directly hand over to you, Stefan, because you're only going to enhance the from the German perspective. Over to you.
Thank you, Rishana. Thank you, Esther, for summarizing well the contribution of our research to the new member states. Now, Germany obviously was singled out right from the start as a reference country because Germany in the past has done relatively well on the housing front. So I quickly want to summarize in my own words the key findings from the German case study. I want to start off with an overall picture, then some thinking about solutions and some themes that emerged during the fieldwork. So number one, Germany, as we all know, is relatively balanced, offers relatively balanced housing systems in what is called a mixed market economy. Relatively evenly balanced power between landlords and tenants in a country where roughly half of the people actually rent, and in cities it's even much more so. So it's very interesting to think about the renting situation in Germany. That means the key features for the German system overall, it's that we rely on regulation a lot to regulate the private sector, that we need the state subsidies and state as a coordinating entity to deal with that well. And also the research showed that Germany, perhaps more than other countries, uses supply-side models in terms of housing provision, although we have to really be more critical at the moment what happens right now. Yeah, the challenges for Germany are actually quite similar to other countries. We have an issue with rising prices, land prices, building costs, housing finance costs are going up, labor costs are going up. We do have more vulnerability, class-based, so lower middle-income households, but also those vulnerable large families with migration background, refugees, single parents with children, people with disabilities, health issues, and so forth. And I would add actually another point that really over the last couple of months has become very relevant. We have a building freeze risk at the moment, because the old model of how we produced housing doesn't seem to work well at all now under conditions of rising interest rates. But put this aside for a second. Let's move into the Ukrainian Ukraine refugee crisis. Let me start off with a quick look at the Ukrainians themselves. What did they say about their intentions here in Germany? At the end of last year, interesting, 1/3 said we want to stay actually in Germany. We feel we could live here. 1/3 wanted to go back to the Ukraine, and 1/3 was undecided, just to give them also some voice. The main findings of the German side of the case studies. Let me start with an overall observation. Obviously, Germany still has a quite strong welcome culture, although not as strong as Poland, I might say, but still a culture that carries actors with them. And I think this is really this thing. Germany tries to model a whole of society partnership approach to settlement of refugees, whole of society. I come back to this later when I talk about recommendations towards the end of our webinar today. Now, immediate programs here in Germany. Obviously, like in other countries, we have a strong decentralized, dispersed settlement structure at the moment. So Ukrainian refugees settle largely in private accommodation. In Germany, it's 3/4. So that is one issue that also governments want to build on. Governments also here in Germany, federal, state, and local governments talk about rapid integration. So they're really interested in getting refugees integrated in the labor market, in the social systems, and so forth. We also relied a lot last year on ad hoc responses that are now in the process of becoming more systemic, but we still don't quite know actually what that means. So that's an interesting question, isn't it? And also we in Germany can say that we relied a lot on philanthropic and private resources, including the resources of the refugees themselves, very important. Long-term solutions, still early days. It's now almost 1 year since this terrible war started, and we still have to look around and really observe what's going on with long-term models. Germany doesn't have all the answers, believe me. We are certainly seeing moving of the momentum into the existing institutional landscapes. So in Germany, that means the social and charitable associations are becoming more stronger, more involved. Also the municipalities, local governments. And that means also those actors need resources. So it's a lot about development finance where we have to look at the moment. If you ask me about the 10 main interesting points about the fieldwork last year, I would say what came out of the fieldwork was Germany is, and it was said before by Esther, I think, is certainly a settlement country, not a transit country, but a country like Poland, although not on the same scale as Poland, is a country where the refugees will actually settle and not move on to other countries. We also, like other countries as well, we see the current crisis as a pendulum migration crisis. We do not know exactly how many refugees, households will go back to Ukraine. It's also backwards and forwards migration. Makes it very hard to ascertain exactly the need and the requirements for housing provision. Not easy at all. Number 3, I would say, and that's said again, largely urban solutions are being talked about because that's where Ukrainian refugees have settled also in most cases. It's about decentralized accommodation. We talked about this. It's about vulnerability because it's mainly women and children and people with disabilities who have arrived. That means high social integration need. Again, something to talk about perhaps a bit in detail later. Germany has certainly tried to model a strong cross-sector partnership approach with interesting innovation, not just coming from businesses and from the civil society, but also local government was quite interestingly innovative and tried new models. They relied a lot on the findings of the 2015-2016 Syrian refugee crisis. So there was a lot of policy learning that happened. So when I talk to actors now, they seem to be better prepared and know more what to do than, for example, 7-8 years ago. Nevertheless, we see rising tensions, as you would expect, between different factions of the state, between host population and refugees. We all face a cost of living crisis, although those tensions are still mediated quite well in our country here. But there's certainly a clear need for integrated long-term settlement integration planning right now. We have to move to more systemic solutions. And I guess we will talk about it a bit more into detail later. That's me for now. I give back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. Thanks. So Poland has featured prominently in what has been discussed so far. So I think that's a good segue now, Christine, for you to come in and talk to us a little bit more in depth about what we are facing here in Poland. Over to you.
Thanks, Rishana, and thank you to Stefan and Esther for the presentation. I mean, a lot of issues have been mentioned already through the research, and I think I'll just give a bit the flavor of what that means for refugees here in Poland. Just as a quick recap, there are officially 1.5 million refugees from Ukraine who have registered with the Polish authorities. and who therefore are under temporary protection. So this protection gives them access to more or less all of the services, including healthcare, education, and so on and so forth. And as Stefan mentioned, it's true, and until today, a lot of them have been housed privately. So friends, family, strangers who just opened their homes, some also in accommodation centers. But there has been here also in Poland what we would call also a whole of society approach in the response, in the emergency response, with a lot of actors who were not professional in humanitarian help. No one really was, because Poland never faced such a situation, having responded to the needs of the people, but also particularly when it comes to accommodation. Uh, Stefan said it's still early on, but interestingly, I think in this situation, if I look back a year ago, we were on the one hand dealing with the emergency situation of having so many people arriving very quickly, having to find where to house them, to feed them, to take care of them. But at the same time, already from day two, we were already in the long term, because we knew all of these temporary solutions were temporary in nature, and therefore quickly there would need to be discussion of a longer term. And when this discussion comes, obviously accommodation is the number one need of anyone, whether they're envisaged to say 3 months or 3 years, or they actually don't know. But nothing that has been provided as short-term accommodation is enough for people to project themselves in the future. So we, as UNHCR, we do what we call protection monitoring. So that means we engage every day with refugees to try to understand their situation, the challenges they're facing, the some of the needs they have. And from the results of our monitoring, accommodation is always identified as the most urgent need by refugees. It doesn't mean it's the only need they have, but it's the number one identified. So that it is clearly confirmed by the research, not the research, but by the monitoring we are doing. And when we try to unpack what that means, I mean, and this is where I will connect with some of the findings that Esther presented. It's different issues conglomerating, right? So of course there's a lack of affordable housing in Poland. There was before, and of course this has been even more critical following the arrival of refugees and the overall inflation and increase of prices of rent, but also commodities and so on, which makes housing a big budget for anybody staying in Poland. So there's a lack of affordable housing, and it's also refugees face sometimes particular challenges in this context, but also in other contexts. You might have landlords who are not willing to rent to refugees because they feel that maybe they would not get their rent paid, or they would not be able to, or they're afraid that they would not take care of the property. We also hear that some landlords are not willing to rent to women with children, which is really the main population of refugees in this context, with also sometimes persons with other type of with some vulnerabilities. Sometimes the guarantees being asked are not rational, I would say, or not according to the market. So there are a higher threshold has to be met by refugees, which in essence is not helpful, because we know refugees find themselves often in situations where they cannot meet all the requirements. Sometimes there's issue legalizing the lease agreement, so landlords are not willing to do the proper paperwork and rather keep it informal, which creates some legal insecurity, obviously for refugees who could be for the tenants who could be kicked out from one day to the other. And there's also some specific housing challenges, as I think Stefan mentioned. There is an elderly population that is part of the refugee population. There's a high proportion of persons with disabilities, and they need housing that will be adapted to their needs, which is not so easy to find. Indeed, there is also a limited stock of social housing in Poland, as they mentioned that. I will not go back to it, but it's almost impossible nowadays for a refugee family or for a Polish family for that matter to access social renting, and that would put them also in clear competition, which then raise other concerns with regards to social cohesion and competition for scarce resources. And when we speak to refugees, obviously they don't really know where to look for, right? If you live in an accommodation center, or if you know the time is running out in your at the neighbors who's been hosting you, where to go, how to look for it, how to negotiate the rent, and so on. The second element, of course, is linked to the financial resources. Some refugees work, but sometimes the work and the salary they get is not enough to rent on the private market, and that's one problem. A number of this population having a number of vulnerabilities is not able to work, or to only have partial work, which will not really help them to access the rental market. Financial assistance is available, but not to a large scale. Some humanitarian organizations are doing some cash programs. The government has a social protection program and some different allocations, allowances that can help, but that alone also is not going to be able to help with the renting in itself. So with all of these obstacles, we see that refugees don't really know where to turn to and what kind of solutions are there. I'll just say that I think Esther presented a number of options on the table, and a lot of these questions need to be resolved by governments. In the context of Poland, there needs to be a plan, but there needs to be a plan also in using different options and to use different toolboxes, because there's not going to be a huge change of new construction overnight. Everything takes time, so there needs to be different modalities operating at the same time if we want to maybe really make progress. And maybe as often refugee crises are a bit of a shock for societies to absorb, but they also create opportunities to maybe tackle issues that are pre-existing a crisis, and can give maybe opportunities to look into solving more longer term problems also because of the crisis. I will leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christine. Stefan, can I hand back to you now to kind of wrap it up with the broader recommendations?
Thank you. Thanks, Christine. Thank you, Rishana. In a way, what I'd like to do now is, before we hopefully have some question and answer time, I am not sure if maybe 5 minutes at the end, that would be good. I'd like to wrap up and what I would like to do is talk more about what I would call the higher hanging fruit, because a lot of the immediate recommendations that our products offer talk about here and now solutions. And that's of course very important, but we also have to think about longer term responses that actually are able to bring together the pre-existing affordable housing crisis with the new pressures induced by refugee streams, particularly Ukrainian, but also we have other increasing refugee streams coming now, and we certainly will see also 3 earthquakes, probably another wave coming. So it's certainly high time to think about how to bring those things together. So let me talk about 5 strategies that we should be thinking about, although I acknowledge that's really hard stuff. Number 1, and that's also what the research showed, is we need to look at the existing housing stock. And I think it was talked about already by Esther. So those so far unused residential housing spaces have to be used much more. We have to build capacity to deal with that, including data capacity, including legal, including the many interventions that are needed for that. So to activate and utilize the unused and underused spaces of existing housing is probably the most important issue right now. And that gives us a lot of food for thought and scope for action. Obviously, the challenges are big, especially in those times of poly-crisis we're all facing now, but this is still, the existing housing stock matters a lot. At the same time, we have to think about construction again, construction of new housing, conversing existing housing, retrofitting housing. And here we not only talk about the affordability for existing residents and for refugees, but we also have those important and vexed drivers like demographic changes and climate change at our doorstep. And we have to think about all those policy goals when we think about investing in new housing. The third strategy obviously comes out strongly out of this research is the one which I would call metropolitan urban and housing strategies, looking at the cities again. Obviously, the cities have become our growth model for the current our current political economies, but we also strongly see how affordability and profitability at the moment do not match very well. We have some real issues. It seems like the private sector driven housing investment reaches strong limits because people don't have the money to pay for that. So how do we deal with that? We have new policy blueprints like the Leipzig Charta, who talk about common good oriented urban planning and so forth. And we have many other well-meaning agendas. But really, this is a really question for all of us. How do we provide housing in our cities for the years and decades to come under the difficult conditions? The fourth strategy concerns the rural area, the non-urban areas. Obviously, there we have housing often available, but we lack infrastructure. The housing has to be made ready use to be used for actually living. And we see a lot of risks because if we want to invest in the rural countryside, how do we deal with the issue that we don't know if refugees will move back to Ukraine and then these houses will not be used anymore? So we have vexed questions also about infrastructure and housing provision in the non-urban areas. And the fifth long-term strategy really is about reforms that deal with tenure. And Esther's contribution was telling, wasn't it, that we see in Germany quite a well-balanced tenure structure, but in many countries we see home ownership clearly being the preferred model. And at the moment, all the indicators show that people are moving into the rental systems. So we have to actually really make those rental systems, both public and private, and I say public and private, we have to make them future-proof. And again, this is a hard one because we have lots of subsidies and power has moved into the home ownership, building up home ownership over the last 40 to 50 years. So here we wrestle with power relations, with leadership issues, with change capability issues, and all that in the matter of the poly crisis. To, I guess, advocate those rather higher hanging fruits, and we thought about quite early on about what could we use, and I came up with an idea to build a let's call it housing-led refugee integration model, being in the center of transformation, a bit like Housing First, that was created as a way to deal with homelessness in a new way, where housing was in the center of interventions. Why don't we think about the same for refugees as well? And that means also for the host populations and those people who need affordable housing. And I came up with an interesting, nice infographic. I hope it works. I will share with you my screen. Let's see if we can do this. 1 second. I don't think I can do it, but I could forward it later to Rishana. We may put it in the in the documents because that's quite an interesting one. What is it a matter of housing-led integration for refugees? It really is about thinking about the integration in terms of labor market integration, getting the children into schools and into community systems, making sure the refugees are culturally integrated in terms of language acquisition, in terms of getting the social know-how, the cultural know-how to deal in the new environment. It's about community and neighborhood integration, and it's about wider social and welfare integration as well, and making those integration themes possible through housing first in the settlement agenda. So think about from housing outwards into helping those integration to happen better. I will put the model later over to Rishana, and then we may talk about this, because that may be an activating framework for all of us. And as we said, also in Poland, Germany has shown that the whole of society approach is important. That is not just an agenda for one sector. That means the whole of society. We all have to work together to make this work. I guess that's me, and maybe we have a couple of questions still coming. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Stefan. Just a quick point. So, picking up from your very interesting idea about the housing led approach, in Poland, the government has just kind of started launching a pilot project, actually looking at a solution to the refugee issues, bringing together housing, education, and employment as kind of key focus areas. So, that's a pilot that Habitat is also engaged in. So, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. So thank you again. We do have a few questions here. Let me take this question. I think, Stefan, is directed to you. Could you give us some information about the pilot of an online-based distribution platform currently tested in Germany for Ukrainian refugees, choosing their most appropriate location in Germany? Are you aware of that platform, Stefan?
Well, I work with an organization called what's called Partnership for Ukraine, and they developed it with many stakeholders. I think they worked on that, so I'm aware of it. Yes, I know that they are piloting and work on this, but I'm not. Unfortunately, didn't have time to really monitor progress. So I know that some interesting is going on. I could later on provide maybe the name and the organization in my email to you, Rishana. You can share it. And then people can maybe get more information via website or yes, there is interesting stuff going on. And again, it's part of the innovation, the bottom-up innovation that you can see also here in Germany. Yeah.
Okay, great. So, Christine, there are two questions directed to you. One is, out of the three proposed models, that's the tenant, landlord, or intermediary-based models, which have the biggest potential to scale in Poland in the short term?
I think it's a good question for Habitat for Humanity to respond to. I'm no shelter expert, just want to say, or housing expert. But I think in my modest opinion, as I said, it will take different models to even get to the critical mass. So I would, again, very humbly, not being an expert, probably look into trying to activate all of these models, because I think they all have the potential for good results. But as you said in the question, it's really the scale. Everything here is the scale. You have a lot of pilot projects, you have a lot of initiatives that are interesting, but it's for 100 families, 500 families. But here we're talking, I'm not saying there are 1.5 million refugees in need of housing. As Stefan said, we don't have a lot of visibilities of what is the core. But if you take, there's still a very large number of people staying in collective centers. That alone is a big number according to the authorities, and therefore these small initiatives, although very useful, we need to see what can be scalable, and that's really the core of the matter. So I would say it's a mix, plus it's also a money issue. If you want to give housing allowance to refugee tenants, you need to have a budget for that. And from what we gather, there's no real such plans, at least in Poland.
Yes, thank you. And I think, as a practitioner here with Habitat in Warsaw and in Poland, I completely agree with you. I think we need all three models. We've tested some of them work, but then those are not sustainable in the long term as well, right? So then what is the sustainable model that would work here? So another question for you, Christine, which communities are most at risk in Poland?
I'd say that the way we present it is to say the population that could work is probably working, right, one way or the other, and those who had solutions, they have find their own way around. I think the communities at risk are those that we visit regularly in collective centers, because the centers were meant to be short term, were meant to be transit. Unfortunately, there are people there who've been there for several weeks, several months, with no real perspective of what's next. They have nowhere else to go, probably not also a possibility to return to Ukraine immediately. So that's a concern, and often, unfortunately, in these collective centers, you also find the groups that are most vulnerable, meaning a number of elderly persons with medical conditions or mental health issues. You also find the mother with kids. So you have there a potential also marginalized groups like the Roma community that has also a hard time to find housing. So there you have compounded vulnerabilities, which mean that if we were to solely focus, and I'm not saying we should, but solely focus on that group, that would take, again, a huge effort from a lot of actors and also a very tailored approach because the needs are very different. So there you have a aggregation of vulnerabilities that is concerning if we cannot find at least midterm solution, if not long-term solution.
Thank you. And then, Esther, I think this question, I'll share this with you. Could you elaborate how the operational cost of the intermediary kind of option could be secured for the longer term?
Yes, we talk about that a little bit in our study that at the beginning it has to be covered also by subsidy, but it also depends on the whatever the composition of the tenant of the agency or of the whole system, whether how much it can include people with higher income who has maybe no income problem at all or just smaller, and the most vulnerable and in between. So how much they can cross-subsidize the lower income households, or could just generate income from the rent also to cover their operational costs. So if a social rental agency only help to house very vulnerable people, then of course they cannot really generate income for their operational costs. So it has to come from outside, from external resources. But if they can have a wider range of tenants with different level of income, then they have some possibilities to generate income also for their costs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thanks. Any comments on that question from our other panelists? No. Okay, so there don't seem to be any other questions, and we are right on time to wrap up. So before concluding, actually, just to mention that for the last several years, Habitat has already been advocating on two of the key recommendations coming out from this research. We have been developing models for social and affordable housing while also bringing together diverse stakeholders through our Empty Spaces program to work together to increase the housing stock in some of these countries. I hope all of you who've joined us at this webinar, I hope you consider the recommendations presented today as a call to action so that we can collectively contribute towards mitigating the housing crisis in this region. Thank you again to all the panelists and to all the participants for joining. And I think the link has already been posted on where the materials would be available. Yeah. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.